It's a pleasure to be here chairing our last session of our workshop. This session is entitled Demand-Led Growth and Keynesian Policies. We have our special guests here, Tom Paley and Stephen Fazzani. I am sure you know them, but they deserve some introduction. So Professor Fazzani is here with us. He is now the emeritus professor at the Washington University. And Tom Paley is the editor of ROKE and also the founder of the Economics for Democratic and Open Societies. We are going to start with Professor Fazzani, so the floor is yours.
Hello. It's a bom dia, something like that. So it's again a pleasure to be back here at the workshop and in Rio de Janeiro, Copacabana, amazingly beautiful. And so thank you for the invitation. I keep talking about the United States and you keep inviting me, so I suppose it's okay. There are, just before I move on here, there's two strange punctuation marks on my title slide. This one, Letícia just mentioned, so I have about 3 weeks, maybe 3.5 weeks now, become Professor Emeritus, which means I have time to work on research finally. And so I'm glad to be back here and doing that. And in fact, there is a paper for this topic, which means I had more time. Second one is the title, Provocative Thoughts on Fiscal Policy, but with a question mark after provocative. This would certainly be provocative in a mainstream discussion. Probably not very provocative here, but in any case, that's the idea. I thought about changing the title, but thought, well, you know, we should know where we are in that context. I guess there was that comment in the last session about talking to the Brazilian central bank. I can only imagine if I gave this talk to any mainstream audience in the United States, I'd have a lot of trouble, as it will be clear as we go through. So we move on. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the research project that's been going on. Interestingly, many of you know, if you've heard me talk about these things before, I actually, my PhD dissertation, 1982, is on inherit and instability and on demand-led growth. And then I kind of took a break and got back to it in 2013, where we were talking about autonomous demand as the floor, and the capacity as the ceiling, the economy kind of bouncing and realized that in fact it was possible that maybe it would convert to a steady state. It wouldn't necessarily just bounce between the floor and the ceiling, and that steady state is the super multiplier model. And so this has become a big part of what I've been thinking about in recent years. The idea that supply follows demand, which is central to what I'll be talking about today, is in a couple of papers, a theory, more or less theory paper with my longtime co-authors from Italy, and then a paper with Alejandro Gonzalez, my graduate student who is now Dr. Alejandro Gonzalez. Many of you know Alejandro. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here because he's trying to get his visa to go to his job at the Peruvian Central Bank, but he will be here in South America soon in many ways. And then the paper I presented here last year kind of tying some ideas together, 3 principles which are necessary and I would argue even sufficient for demand-led growth, which is now a manuscript. It just came out in the FMM series. And then monetary policy, another paper I presented here. So finally, talk about fiscal policy. But before I move on, since with the discussion of ROKE, I wanted to point out the 2013 paper here. I don't know if you could see it here, but that's obviously our co-authors there. But volume 1, number 1, spring 2013, pages 1 to 21. Thank you, Tom. I feel like I really had I was kind of an inaugural person. Now, I think, in fact, there was another issue before this, but I don't really want to talk about that. Yes. Okay. So on we go. Are we working? Yes. All right. This is just an overview of what I want to talk about today. I'm just going to give a quick summary of the U.S. fiscal policy, so-called scary data from the mainstream point of view. And then spend a little bit of time talking about the conflicting theories, neoclassical, and demand-led growth. Obviously familiar here. I feel a little bit, I suppose the word would be a bit naked because I don't have a lot of model here. I'm going to be talking about the implications, but I'm trusting that this audience knows the model very well. Pretty much a basic super multiplier model, and I'll talk about some modifications. And then to finish up mostly with the policy implications and some data, as I always do, some charts to try to justify the points that I'm making. And of course, the US focus. I always feel a bit embarrassed coming to Brazil and talking about the United States, but again, you keep inviting me. Okay, so on we go. So this is my dive into artificial intelligence. I asked the AI, give me a scary picture. And this is what they came up with. So there you go. That's one slide I don't have to spend much time on. So just very quickly, U.S. federal debt to GDP ratio. The blue line's with longer history. The dotted green line is the debt actually held by the public, which doesn't go back as far, but obviously we're back up to those World War II level things that when I started teaching in the early 1980s, people, oh, we'd never get to this level, and here we are, about 100% of GDP. This one is the deficit relative to GDP. Again, not the World War II levels, but if you look, it's not hard to see, besides the volatility, a downward trend in this way, which is, again, of concern. And this one really is probably the one that's getting the most attention now in the mainstream press, which is the rise in interest payments as a percent of GDP, which you see, of course, is skyrocketing here with the rise in interest rates after the COVID period. Although it has stabilized, I should tell you that this, I guess this is probably ending about 23 or 24. I should have updated. If you look, it's now reasonably stable. It hit about 3%, and it's stayed about there. Okay, so that's what everybody is worried about. That's what they're scared about. What about the theoretical frameworks? Well, we start off with, and I should have maybe mentioned this at the beginning. So the idea for this particular way of talking about fiscal policy in a demand-led growth world started with discussions I was actually having with a finance person about the long-run debt to GDP ratio and this ratio here, which you see the simple idea of effectively accounting identity for debt and then solving for the debt to GDP ratio in long-run steady state, which is effectively the primary deficit share of GDP divided by the difference between the growth rate, and I had a little wrinkle here, the tax-adjusted interest rates. And interest will generate some taxes. That's probably worth recognizing. Probably reasonably small, though, as a practical matter. And the talk I want to give today is kind of disciplined by this particular ratio, or this equation, this long-run steady state D star, and thinking about how do we think about all these variables on the right-hand side of that equation from different theoretical perspectives. Now, in some respects, it would be reasonable to criticize this, and some people I've talked to about this issue have criticized it, saying, look, the dynamics are very slow, it takes a long run to get there, short-run fluctuations are very high. The denominator, of course, is a small number, the difference between the growth rate and the interest rate, and so small changes in the denominator have big changes in the D star. But I guess I want to state that I see this still as a center of gravity. It gives us a sense of where we are headed. And if you're going to talk about scary fiscal policy, then thinking about fiscal policy using this accounting identity effectively as a kind of organizing principle, I think, is helpful. So that's kind of the first theory point. Let me just talk a bit about what I'm calling the standard consensus model. I get tired of that word mainstream. I don't know if standard consensus is better, but that's what I'm using here. Orthodox, I think Esteban used orthodox. I think that's maybe even better. So again, I have the disciplining equation on the top. And so what does the mainstream tell us about this? Well, first off, growth is primarily determined by the supply side, neoclassical synthesis, Keynesian short run, classical in some sense long run, as I told my students for many years about this theory. So that is technology, demographics. There could be some tweaks on tax policy and things, but those are more levels and growth rates anyway. Endogenous growth theory could come in here, but again, all supply side oriented. The long run interest rate, very important, the natural or neutral rate. And again, this is a loanable funds concept that would match saving forthcoming at full employment with investment, or a more general form of that would include the government deficit and the external balance, the current account deficit, and foreign saving. But again, there's only one interest rate for any given set of parameters that comes this way, and it's basically, I'll maybe say more about it, largely outside of policy in some sense. Again, if you have a higher deficit, that's going to be more borrowing. It drives up the neutral interest rate. But broadly speaking, this is certainly not something under control of the monetary policy. That's the general view. Government spending, share, gamma, and the tax rates are the policy variables. So the basic idea here is, again, following from a loanable funds way of thinking, which is that higher debt or higher deficits raise the interest rate, and that is going to reduce investment, factor substitution. So Professor Kurtz has left us, but he explained to us why this is problematic for all of us in the room, but that's the story that is mainstream. And so we have this concern that that a high D star will slow down the economy, slow down capital investment, slow down research and development, possibly spill over to growth. That will be a little stronger, and certainly threaten sustainability because it raises the interest rate, and the DOMAR condition of our ratio could easily turn to the wrong side, and we would have explosive debt to GDP. So responsible fiscal policy is a low primary deficit, which means cutting spending or raising taxes. And that's really where at least in the US context and probably in many other countries, that's where the debate is. Which one should we do? Everybody agrees we should be lowering the primary deficit, which way we should go. And this is true whether you're, I don't know, Mitt Romney or Barack Obama, to give two more reasonable sides of the political debate in the US. The current administration is in a different world. Okay, so enough on this, really. I think that's all pretty straightforward, but it's good to lay it out. So demand-led growth. Again, I'm not presenting a formal model here. I have a few derivatives down the road and a few slides down the road that come from a more formal analysis, but I suppose I can't really expect that the folks that were here in this room last year when I was talking about this paper would remember the details. But the paper is available now. It wasn't last year, it is now. And I just want to lay this out in the broad sense. So the three principles that I'm basically saying are both necessary and I think sufficient, you can question me on that, for demand-led growth are listed here. The first is basically an effective demand point. Firms produce what they expect to sell. Demand drives production and employment. Not much more to be said about that. Number two, I think, is sometimes missed. I think we've touched on it here, but maybe I do believe it's worth emphasizing, which is the sense, of course, demand mattering beyond the short run. That's implicit in a lot of the models that many of us in the room are working with, but why? And I think the secondary point on the slide is helpful. Wage and price adjustment need not be stabilizing. It probably won't be. There's been some mention of Keynes chapter 19 here in our 90th anniversary celebration. I've wrote some papers about this early on. Minsky talked about these issues, that basically the mainstream interpretation of Keynes is because of sticky wages and prices, but any practical economist, including very mainstream folks like Ben Bernanke, to the last thing we want is deflation. I have never understood that inconsistency. I remember Bernanke saying, under no circumstances will we allow deflation. We're going to fight it all the way. I pull the Abel and Bernanke textbook off the shelf, and what do I see is that the reason we have unemployment is because wages and prices don't fall fast enough. So I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. But I don't think that's really that controversial or provocative. What is more controversial is, again, a topic that I addressed in a paper a couple of years ago, is that monetary policy is possibly a weak mechanism to make this work. Because, again, the kind of new Keynesian story these days is really not about deflation or disinflation restoring full employment. It's about a wise central bank that can do the appropriate things, target inflation, set a Taylor rule, however you want to do it, and the result will be that in the long run will converge to the supply-driven path, and demand fades into the background. And I have been critical of that view, and that's point number two. Point number three is what I feel, at least I'm certainly not the only one. My friend Tom here has certainly been part of this. Mark Setterfield has been part of it, as have many others. We've heard about Calder-Verdurn here several times, which is this idea that there is a connection between the dynamics of demand and the dynamics of supply. That supply is not independent of demand. In someone put all the papers here, the 2020 paper that I did with Piero and Anna Maria Viriato, we in the Cambridge Journal, we started this process by connecting the unemployment rate to both the productivity growth rate and the labor supply growth rate. Alejandro and I estimated that model empirically in a paper that just came out a year or so ago in the Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control. And the basic story is that faster aggregate demand growth lowers unemployment, and you have a stronger economy, that's going to spill over to the supply side. We'll see faster technological improvement. We'll pull more people into the labor force so that strong demand, lower unemployment, basically a stronger economy, faster supply growth. This is related to the Kaldor-Verduin law, but there are some important differences. And so for those of you that are interested, maybe I should talk to Alejandro about doing a separate paper on this topic, but kind of buried in our JEDC paper is a short period, some estimates, explaining how the way you specify the Kaldor-Verduin law matters a lot for this purpose. In particular, that what we have and what we emphasize is that it's the level of economic activity that affects the growth rate of supply. Different from the basic Kaldor-Verduin, where it's the growth rate that affects the growth rate. And actually, that's not sufficient to have, in our context, to have supply converge to demand. But if you have this level on growth effect, that does make it work. So I point that out. So there's a formalization of all these things, but it's going to be in the background of my talk today. Okay, on we go. This I did not intend to include, but I put it in here anyway, because 2 days ago, sitting in my hotel room, read something about recent rises in US productivity, which would be output per hour. You can see it right here, doing pretty well. I just wonder how that correlation is holding up. Alejandro and I estimated this in a more formal econometric way, but this simple correlation between the 5-year productivity growth rate and the 5-year average unemployment rate. 5-year average in both cases, moving averages. And the negative correlation is really pretty obvious, is it not? That when we have low unemployment, we have faster productivity growth, as you see here, and vice versa. So this is a very informal empirical support for this key hysteresis connection, the idea that demand leads supply. Okay, so let's go back to policy. So what about demand-led growth and public debt? So again, I have the disciplining equation up here, the long-run debt to GDP ratio, and how do we think about this in the demand-led growth context? Well, again, tax rates largely set by policy. I will have something to say about which tax rates. In particular, the way that they spill over to aggregate demand is important, but for now, we think of the tax rates in this equation as set by policy. But the growth rate is driven by aggregate demand dynamics. We have the super multiplier world here, and so the growth rate is part of the demand side, not the supply side. Now, there is a downward limit there. Again, if I had the formal model here, we could talk about this in more detail, that it is at some point there will be ultimately constraints. In our model, it's a minimum unemployment rate that you can only push it down so far to generate the accommodating supply. But there's a continuum of growth paths that are all going to be tied to the growth path of demand. And so, this is my provocative point number one, but not here, that the growth rate should be driven by the supply side by the demand side. Somehow, I don't know, Milton Friedman enters my brain here somehow. But yeah, that's right. Let me try again. That the growth rate should be driven primarily by the demand side rather than the supply side would be provocative in most economics audiences, but not in this room. Second point, again, looking back at the variables in the equation, that the natural interest rate doesn't exist. That is, there's not a single interest rate that equates supply to demand. Supply economy, the hysteresis connection, my point number three, it causes the supply side to converge to the demand side, largely independent of the interest rate. You could tell some stories about how interest rates might be affected, but if that basic connection between the strength of the economy and the growth of supply holds, then regardless of the interest rate, you're going to get supply to accommodate demand. And so there is no single natural interest rate that's determined independent of dynamic demand dynamics. And again, this is linked to this idea. This is a more static point here. The long-run interest rate is independent of a primary deficit. Why? Because borrowing creates saving. Esteban, I don't know, are you here still? Oh, he just stepped out. Well, anyway, Esteban talked about chapter 14 of the general theory, which is something I've told this story many times, that I've rediscovered various people, rediscovering Herod, rediscovering Serrano. I rediscovered some Keynes here too, because when I was first teaching graduate macro as a very green, young 26-year-old assistant professor, I had to kind of come to terms with this whole loanable funds story. And I realized, what happened? It's that saving is not independent of income. And that to think of the saving and investment curves as somehow independent of demand it was logically inconsistent. And I was very proud of myself for that interpretation and what I shared with my students. And then, of course, I go back and read the general theory and say, Keynes had this all. I probably explained it more clearly. But in any case, if borrowing creates saving, that pushes right away pushes back, even in a static sense, against the idea that that government deficits raise interest rates. Government deficits create income. Income is going to be, moving through the economy, through the multiplier process. Some of it will generate new taxes. Some of it will generate the saving until in equilibrium, the total saving will offset the total borrowing. So again, provocative point number 2, in the mainstream sense. I don't know if you've thought about it quite that much here, but I suspect for most of you this is pretty straightforward. A little bit of data. I love this chart. So, in the US, we're to push up interest rates, demand too much debt, interest rates are going to rise. Wall Street Journal pretty much every week is worried about this. Here's the, 40 plus year history of the real 10-year Treasury bond rate and the US debt to GDP ratio. It's going to take, as Olivier Blanchard once said about something else, an incredible amount of econometric ingenuity to change this basic history into the opposite correlation. That is, we're supposed to see higher debt leading to higher interest rates. It's exactly the opposite. Now, I don't really take this as causation. I mean, in some indirect sense, possibly so. Why has the interest rate fallen during this period? It's a lot of interesting history about the inflation, about monetary policy, about stagnant demand, and then the connection and the fiscal policy, also some issues here, both in politics and economics. But the point is that the idea that how higher debt is pushing up higher interest rates seems to me it's really going to be very hard to justify. Okay, so again we have this equation. We're seeing growth from the demand side. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not the equation I thought it was. All right, so if we remember the debt to GDP, the D-star equation, debt to GDP ratio in steady state, we've talked about the growth rate, we've talked about the interest rate, we've talked about the tax rates. The remaining important variable here is the share of government spending in GDP. And this is the gamma star I have here in this context. So the first point is to start with the idea of thinking of government spending as the only source of autonomous demand. So again, I'm going to, Franklin's right here, but I'm talking about you now. And he taught me this many years ago at a seminar, that the share of autonomous demand in output is endogenous. It has to be endogenous. It's going to be the difference between the leakages, as you can see here, after-tax saving taxes, and in this case, investment alone. If you could put the international balance in here as well to generalize this. And so if government spending is equal to autonomous demand, total autonomous demand, which I'm calling Z here for a little bit of notation, then if we have faster growth of government spending, that's going to raise the economy's growth rate. Autonomous demand is growing at an autonomous rate. So if the overall economy is rising faster, the share of autonomous demand in output is going to fall. And that's the adjustment. And it's somewhat counterintuitive, the idea that government spending growing faster would cause a decline in the share of government spending in GDP, but it's well known, and I've cited some of the people here, probably not all of them, that have identified that, aside from me in kind of a few false start papers. But the important point here then is that the government share is not set by policy, which again, provocative number 3. Go to tell either the Brazilian central bank or the Federal Reserve or the ECB and say that in the long run, the share of government spending in GDP is not a policy choice. You're going to find that probably pretty hard to accept, but it's a natural result of this way of thinking, the demand-led growth approach. Now, this is, in some respects, is part of the reason I've been slow to get a fiscal policy paper out, because I started with that result. I thought, this is great, I've got this all figured out, and then realized, wait a second, you have to realize that government spending is not the only part of autonomous demand. So here there's a little bit of additional work that in the next few slides, a little more original than what I've set up to this point. So I've done a little calibrating work here. I want to do more. that government spending in the US as a share of autonomous demand is quite large, about half. And this is my way of looking at these things and defining these things. You might make it a little bit smaller because I don't have the debt finance consumption. There's a question of what's truly autonomous. But if you take federal government spending relative to, which includes the social spending, includes the medical spending and Social Security, which probably could be adjusted for a saving rate, but the saving rate is likely very small. You compare that to other components like state and local spending, exports, residential investment, you get this number around 50%. So it's big, but it's not all of it. So what's happening here, and I think somebody earlier in the talk, I'm sorry I'm not remembering it, there were many talks in the last 4 days, but it mentioned this, that so if you have an increase in federal spending growth, that is going to reduce the share of total autonomous demand and output, but you're going to raise the share of government spending in total autonomous demand. G over C rises if the other components are unchanged. And again, a number of the Brazilian folks, among others, have identified this point. So where are we here? We're kind of in a bit of a conundrum in terms of putting this all together. So in thinking about this over the last few months, I've kind of look at this with 3 models. 2 of them are kind of extreme, and the middle one is the one I like the best. So if government spending growth rises, one possibility is that non-government autonomous demand, the other part of Z, rises immediately by the same amount. I think Fabio's paper kind of has that effect there, although he qualifies it. The second one, the second one would be it never changes. That is, we have a rise in government spending growth, but everything else stays at the initial level. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 is, I guess we're calling this the adaptation model. And so the idea here is that you have, this is Z, I need to improve my notation, but Zn, the part of autonomous demand that's not government spending, grows at, that's supposed to be a Zn2, so well, okay, it is what it is, at some rate. So that's what's going on. But what's happening here, these 2 variables are supposed to be the same thing. So this growth of autonomous demand that's not the federal government adapts to the actual growth rate of the economy. So the idea here is that over time, let's take residential investment as example. Over time, if we start to have a more aggressive fiscal policy and faster government spending growth, then is residential investment going to keep staying forever at the same old lower growth rate? Well, probably not. So I have an L here to put a rather long leg. I have a alpha, which is potentially very slow speed of adjustment. But in some sense, there's a response to the rest of the autonomous demand to what's happening to the federal government. So let me show you some calibrated model results. And this is, I want to work more on the calibration, but the intention here is to be fairly representative of the US economy. So here's this is a lot of stuff on this graph, but basic story is the rise of, we start with all of autonomous demand growing at 2%. Government spending, federal government spending rises to 2.5%. So you see that there's a tendency to a conversion to 2.5% up here from 2% in terms of economic growth. Unemployment falls. That tends to bring the supply side along with it. Then these bottom 2 are more the fiscal policy points, sorry. This one is the government share from the 3 models, and this one is the debt output ratio. So the blue line would be the version in which the rest of autonomous demand just jumps up right away. And then we get what you would expect. The government spending share actually does have a small initial increase, and then it declines to a new steady state level. The debt to GDP ratio monotonically declines. In the other case, where the rest of autonomous demand never changes, the other extreme case, that's the red dotted line. And here what you see is that the government share actually rises and keeps rising. It will eventually asymptote, but we're talking about centuries. It'll be very, very slow, because eventually it'll be, if you let it grow faster forever, it will eventually be everything. But that's kind of irrelevant. And anything else, maybe I'll come back to the debt to output ratio in a second. Well, it eventually goes up. Let's just leave it at that point. I think I have more to say about this in a minute. But my preferred version is that adapted model, which is the heavy black line. It's kind of in the middle. And here you see with the US calibrated case that the debt to output ratio, that gamma in my equation, is actually falling. that with what I consider reasonable empirical parameters, faster government spending growth reduces the debt to output ratio. It's not absolutely guaranteed, but it seems likely. Actually, I think it's probably later in the slide, but since I have this picture up here, I'll make it now, which is if you look at the red line, which from a kind of Keynesian fiscal policy point of view is the worst, kind of the worst outcome. It's interesting, these are years down here. This is calibrated annual level. So you see that actually it's hard to see here. I could maybe use a different scale, but it actually declines for I think about 17 years. It takes 17 to 18 years to even get back to its original level. And what's happening is the growth rate of the economy is faster. And so even though the government share is rising in total autonomous demand, the overall growth effect dominates that effect for a couple of decades. And I think I have some statistics later on this topic. So even in the worst case, in some sense, there's a sense in which austerity would be self-defeating, and that expansion is actually, if not reducing the government debt to output ratio, at least it's not raising it significantly. So, I coming here to talk in autonomous demand land, I have this kind of idea. It seemed sensible to me about the adaptation model, and I'll be interested in what the discussion is along these lines. But does it really violate the sense of autonomous? In some sense, I'm saying that eventually these other components will respond. They're, in a sense, become somewhat induced. And so is that, is this kind of heresy in some sense? Well, the mechanical response of everything else to a change in fiscal policy or government spending growth is also not autonomous. I don't think it's entirely reasonable. You could use it as a steady state argument, but you have to get there, and I think the adaptive model gets there. But the idea that, as I said this before, actually, that the non-government part of autonomous demand would never respond to the state of the economy also seems to me to be in some sense unreasonable. And for some of the folks that are less sympathetic to the supermultiplier models, in particular McCulloch and Nikiforos and Peter Scott, they've made this criticism, and I think with some justification in this sense. And they said, well, wouldn't it be the case that if the economy grew faster or slower, that these other components would, in an American sense, if government spending if the economy is growing faster, wouldn't eventually people want bigger houses or something like that? And so that's the logic I'm using here. And it makes me think about this question. So this really is a question mark here. Is this notion of autonomy more of a continuous variable than a discrete variable? That is, that there are different senses of autonomous, and I think legs would probably play an important role in that thing. But in that context, I do believe that government spending is likely to be the most autonomous, that it's most under control of things that are outside the state of the economy, which I think is useful. And I believe this is an empirical question. I mean, at the end, this is, can I go backwards? Yes. That this, the differences between these models is an empirical question. I'm trying to calibrate these in a reasonable way, but in the end, it's an empirical question. I mentioned that my co-authors are sitting right here, right? That your 2023 paper, Economic, is that right? Yeah. That's a start there. Some time series evidence on the way that different components respond to each other and how that all plays out. But there's more that could certainly be done here. Okay, so what about these transitional results? This is what I was thinking about when I was pointing to the picture before. So in the worst case, unchanged growth of non-government demand, the debt ratio falls slightly on impact. It's below the initial D-star for 30 years. So I understand. I said 20, it's 30. And again, initially, what the benefits of higher aggregate growth dominate the rising share of government spending in the total. And this is kind of interesting. In a calibrated model, so remember they had that alpha term, that adaptive term. So it is possible, if the adaptive term is small enough, that eventually, even in that adaptive model, that the debt to GDP ratio would rise. But I had to set it at 0.04, a half-life of 17 years. And if that happened, then you would eventually get the debt to GDP ratio rising with this calibrated example, but after a century. So as a practical matter, even a tiny bit of adaptation will get you to the result that that faster growth of government spending lowers the share of government spending in GDP and therefore lowers the debt ratio. So I have to say, though, again, at the end of the day, I'm an empirical person, and so do I really believe this? And I mean, that's the model says. Do I really believe this is true? It just seems so counterintuitive. Faster growth of government spending, lower government share. Do I really believe it? So this was actually early in my discussion with Alejandro, who's much better time series economist than me. And so we have this chart here because of Alejandro. And so these are correlations between government spending growth and the share of the gamma, the government spending share in GDP. And so I have to explain this a bit. So this is a long run. This is a long run relationship. And so we're using this Baxter-King filter to pick out longer run frequencies in the data, and also different definitions of what you mean by government spending. So this is a narrow definition, which is just consumption and investment only, which is what we see as G in the GDP equation. But I don't think it's not the right number for this purpose. You really need to include social spending, and then this would be one definition of total autonomous demand. And so what you see here is that when you have a broader measure of government spending, that you start to get negative correlations. That is the counterintuitive result. Faster government spending growth, lower share of government in GDP, federal government in GDP. You do need to have a broader measure of government spending, and it also helps to have a longer term measure. So as you move down through the rows, you're getting lower and lower frequencies of this. You're picking up longer term frequencies in the data. And it obviously gets quite strong. If you look at total autonomous demand at a very long frequency, you have a correlation that's not -1, but it's not far away. So it does suggest that there actually is empirical support for this counterintuitive result. You're going to let me know how we're doing time? Well, so far. How many? 5 more minutes. Ooh. I talk too much. I know I talk fast. Okay. So, well, we'll do our best here. Faster growth of government spending likely reduces the autonomous demand share debt to GDP ratio. Fabio calls it a distinctive feature of super multiplier growth models. I agree. It's interesting. It's provocative. Dynamics are very slow. Also, I should emphasize, why do we see the big increases in the debt to GDP ratio? Because it's short run. It's the big increases, the level increases. And those short run effects may last for a long time. I may say more about the fiscal stimulus later. So if I'm short on time, let me just get right to the policy implications or interpretation of the policy here. So US federal spending, including the social, is about 22% of GDP, as I said before, a little over 50% of autonomous demand. It's hard to imagine that you can have strong growth in the US economy with fiscal austerity, with half of autonomous demand stagnating. And we've seen some issues along those lines, the stagnation after the Great Recession. Things were even worse in Europe. So, the growth is reasonably good now, but we have all that scare data I started with. So this leads to this mainstream fears. Is it really true? So let me just give a chart here. This is the learner, not the learner, we heard learner today, DOMAR. This is the DOMAR condition for the US for the last 25 years in terms of the denominator of debt to GDP. It is in fact positive. Average is 1.68. In recessions, it goes negative, but it pops back over this period of time. So the growth rate does seem to be greater on average with than the tax-adjusted interest rate. I think I only used a 5% tax rate on interest to do this result. So what's the debt to GDP ratio? The Congressional Budget Office in the U.S. projects the primary deficit at 2.2% of GDP for quite a long time. And that actually accounts for Social Security. Maybe don't worry about the U.S. demands, but Tom and I need to get paid. And so hopefully we will see that I don't think they're going to cut our benefits. And the CBO is assuming that. So what does this imply? A long-run debt ratio of 131%, and we're about 100% today. So it's hardly explosive in some sense in terms of where we're heading. Adjustment may be very slow. In fact, it probably takes, I don't know, at least 50 years to get halfway in that sense if things are stable. So no need for higher taxes to pay interest, no aggregate burden on future generations. This is all just keeping things as they are today. Yeah, I don't know if I want to go here or not. time is short. Okay, let me just tell you what the bottom line is on all this. Is that a thought experiment. You could think about having a government that finances its activities entirely by issuing bonds and never issues tax, never has a zero tax rate, and is still sustainable. So that's my little example here. If you had a 3% GDP, which is too low, I mean, the government, it's not going to be that small, but just as a thought experiment, and this roughly 1.7% denominator of the in the Domar condition, that you would have a sustainable debt to GDP ratio of 1.8 with no taxes at all. Why? Because you just keep financing everything, you keep paying the interest out of the bond issues, and so it does open this thing, is that the idea that every time there's a marginal increase in government spending, you know, if it's from the right, they want to cut tax rates and or they want to spend more on wars. Democrats will say, you know, you're hurting the taxpayers, and if the Democrats want to raise social spending, and the Republicans say you're taking money out of the pockets of the taxpayers. I mean, it hasn't happened. I've got some data in the paper. Tax rates in the U.S. have fallen as the debt to GDP ratio has risen. So it's a misleading perspective. I'm getting close to the end here. So the last point that I want to really emphasize is well, okay, then why should we even reduce the debt to GDP ratio? And this is a bit of a new way of thinking it. MMT is often pointed of view. They're not here to defend themselves, but is to say we don't care. We don't care what it is. Do what you need to do. Learner in some respects, but not even that. But the bottom line here is it affects distribution. That the fiscal path, if we have significant borrowing, means that we'll be issuing new bonds, which is adding to private wealth. It could be, some of that could be foreign as well as domestic. We're paying interest, which is a transfer payment to bondholders. These transfers and wealth creation are not distributionally neutral. They're going to relatively rich parts of the income distribution. And so there's an alternative case for taxing the rich, is to avoid these regressive transfers. What's the difference between regressive transfers and fiscal balance? And the case for lower debt ratio is really distributional, not so much fiscal balance. And part of the way I'm thinking about this is if the economy can handle the kinds of transfers that we saw earlier on, a big increase in the interest without it being inflationary, aren't there better things to do than to pay transfers to the relatively well-off, to the foreign holders of bonds? So I think that is a case for reducing D-star, but you have to do it. You have to do it in a way that respects the demand-led nature of the economy. So again, the functional finance idea, which we just heard about, is to target growth for dynamic full employment. It's not just about having full employment. It's not just about stabilization, but it's about growth as well. And here's where I'd like to have my growth model up there with the hysteresis effects, that we could be growing. Maybe we could be growing faster. It might not be that much. Maybe it's 0.5%. Maybe it's 3%. It's a not 3%, 0.5% more. Maybe a full percentage point more. Probably not much more than that. But those things are significant over the long term. And if supply is accommodating demand, then the supply side will adjust to this thing. And this is where I have this point about the fiscal speed limit, that you can do big things, but just don't do them too fast. You don't have a $20 billion increase in a year or two. You have to do it more slowly over time and allow the supply side to accommodate, but you can do it. And so on the growth side, we really ought to be focused on that G from a demand-led point of view. But we have to pay attention to these distributional effects. How do we do it? One thing is lowering interest rates. And so there is no natural rate here. That's why that's important in the distinction. And so it's a policy choice in terms of what at least short-term and to some extent longer-term interest rates, quantitative easing, and other things that they did are a matter of policy. And that can reduce these transfers. There I'm in provocative number 4. This is what's called fiscal dominance in the US discussion. They will definitely throw me out of whatever mainstream audience I'm talking to if we do that in this case. What about raising taxes on high incomes? I think, yes, this can work. I think there is a post-Keynesian case or a demand-led growth case for raising high income taxes as a way of lowering the debt to GDP ratio. But we do have to pay attention to the demand side of this. So this kind of, again, if I had more equations up here, I could show you the derivation of this derivative of the you see that the saving rate shows up in the numerator. That is, you get a bigger effect of a bigger negative effect of higher taxes if the saving rate is higher. And do I have it? Did I get it wrong? The saving rate is, yeah. No. Right. So you don't want to lower demand. So you want to raise taxes on the people that save a lot. Okay. So that means we want the SY to be big, which means we want to raise taxes on the top. I won't bother talking about fee, which is kind of an interesting thing about consumption out of interest. But I did again calibrate this. I think I get about a 4 percentage point increase in a 4 percentage point decrease in the debt to GDP ratio from a 1 percentage point increase in the tax rate on the top 1% of U.S. This lambda, by the way, is the share of the income earned by the top whatever you look at in this context. So you have to avoid depressing demand. Okay, there are plenty of caveats to this. I mentioned about steady state being irrelevant, low interest. Some of these things people have talked about me. Maria Cristina told me we talked about wealth effects and possibility that low interest rates could raise wealth in some ways and lead to financial instability. Yes. Tom has talked to me about portfolio saturation, which he can comment on it by himself. Doesn't need me to say it. I'm short of time. And then we, of course, had the whole international discussion, and Professor Ghosh's talk was amazing on this topic, and many things that come up when you look at this from a emerging market country perspective than from the U.S. perspective, which I am not dealing with here. So I'm going to finish with this a little bit more kind of philosophical. It's not usually my thing than typical for me. But this is from Brad DeLong's Substack, and I don't know if people know about Brad DeLong and Summers. You know, he's kind of the economic historian. He knows a lot of things. Sometimes he says pretty crazy stuff. Sometimes he says very interesting things. But this really caught my attention. So let me just read it. It said this is talking about fiscal space. Fiscal space. You know, fiscal space is there. Productive capacity is there. My interpretation here is, in particular, they're linked up. That if we have stronger fiscal policy, we'll have more productive capacity. The claim we simply cannot afford to help is not economics, it is metaphysics, a belief structure about the world masquerading as a budget constraint. Very nice phrase, is it not? And yet it does not feel metaphysical if you are the person whose real wage has been flat for 20 years, whose town lost its hospital, whose kids can't get secure jobs. And here we've had these comments on gender. These effects, which I think is entirely appropriate, these effects are not only important in the aggregate, but important across different dimensions of social inequality, including gender. This is Brad DeLong, an objective mismatch between capacity and use of capacity, between what we could do and what in fact we do. This mismatch is experienced from below as confirmation that nothing ever changes, and there is always no money, that political promises are lies. And my interpretation of this is the result: anxiety, despair, anger among folks who believe they've left behind. And we've seen the political implications of that, and they are not pretty. And I think this political dysfunction and the tragic consequences as a result of that are significant issues that go beyond D-stars and lambdas and gammas. So that is it. Obrigado.
Me too. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Before beginning my presentation, I do want to just amplify the comments about ROKE that were made by Ricardo and Matthias. When Matthias and I were discussing in Austin Airport whether to start the ROKE project, we talked a bit about what we wanted ROKE to be. And one of the things we talked about was that it was going to be a new piece of social capital for heterodox economists. And that means we want all of you to have ownership of it and to use it and help us build ROKE as a powerful voice for heterodox economics. And so having ROKE and the Demand-Led Growth Conference work together really fits that beautifully. And as part of that, we will be planning to do a symposium titled something like New Directions in Demand-Led Growth Theory. And I think the papers here have been really excellent, superb. It's outstanding what's going on. And we hope that you will therefore submit them for consideration. Your submissions are part of the process of building ROKE and having ROKE be a megaphone for all of us. Okay, now to my talk. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this closing session. It's an absolutely huge pleasure to share the podium with Steve. I think Steve is one of the economists of my generation. I think this is the 80s cohort. We're now passing into, well, I'm sticking around for another 20 years, and Steve has every intention of doing that too. But I want to say that he's one of those economists from the 80s cohort for which I have the greatest admiration. I mean, he's outstanding in his technical abilities and his economic intuitions. Rarer yet, he has incredible integrity. He's incredibly intellectually generous. He's just an amazingly decent person. And the best thing about him all is that he thinks a lot like me. But the only downside of sharing the podium with him is that I am speaking second, and Steve is a pretty hard act to follow. So my talk today presents what I've termed a general framework for endogenous demand-led growth. I use the word framework very intentionally because it's really presenting a structure for organizing how to think about growth. I've intentionally avoided calling it a general theory, though I think that's how it was initially advertised. Because the fact of the matter is there are multiple theories of demand-led growth. The proposed general framework can represent all those theories and thereby enable comparison of them, and that's its value. But we're not going to have a general theory of demand-led growth to the extent that these theories survive. One disclaimer before I go any further, this is the first time I've presented this material, so please help me find any problems in it if you think there are some. I've already found a couple of typos in the slides themselves. The framework is the product of several articles of mine written over many years, which theorize endogenous demand-led growth, and I was very struck by one of Steve's observations about the need to specify the Kaldor-Verdun law right. I call it the Kaldor technical progress function, which is, I think his 1960 paper is a better way of seeing it. If you've got to have something other than the growth of demand in there. My first attempts at this in the 1990s all failed because I was using the growth of demand as the attempt to generate endogenous growth, and you then just have a sort of dynamic Keynesian income expenditure model where you converge to a single equilibrium growth of demand. The feature I've always emphasized in the work sort of starting sort of in 2012, a little bit before that, is the need to pay attention to the supply side, which I think if you've been watching the sessions, all of these, has been not so much on the supply side. Which is, in the wording of Steve, must accommodate demand growth. That focus on accommodating supply then leads you back to the labor market, where there is a need for a mechanism to balance labor demand and supply growth, or else the unemployment rate will be unstable. There are three structural features of the proposed. Get this right. Okay, I'm just going to put them over here. That's the easier one. Forward. Yes. There are three structural features of the proposed general framework deserving of special attention. The first concerns the macroeconomic structure of the economy, which is illustrated here in Figure 1. The economy consists of 4 blocks: the goods market, firms, the labor market, and households. And the linking arrows are bidirectional, indicating that markets impact firms and firms impact markets. This is really fundamental. How the labor market, goods market link operates depend on how the labor market affects firms and households' behavior. And the main purpose for me of this little figure here is to highlight that firms, i.e. corporations, which I'm going to speak a little bit more about, are the locus of the growth process. And the firm used to figure very prominently in post-Keynesian growth theory, but that prominence has fallen away, and I think it warrants restoration. I wouldn't restore it in the way that it was done, but that's Eichner's megacore, that's the work of Adrian Wood and all that. We've sort of lost sight of that the corporation, such an important institution, and so in need of control, and it needs to be, for political and economic reasons, brought back into the picture. The second structural feature is that the labor market closure is described, how I use it, in terms of balance rather than clearing. Labor market balance requires only that labor supply and demand grow at the same rate so that the unemployment rate is constant along the growth path. It is the Keynesian way to specifying labor market outcomes, and it is consistent with involuntary unemployment. Labor market clearing is the classical macroeconomic way of specifying labor markets. It requires the level of labor demand equal the level of labor supply so that there is no involuntary unemployment. The third structural feature concerns technical progress, and the pattern of outcomes is obviously dependent on the type of technical progress. And as widely known, there are 3 forms of technical progress: Harrod neutral, labor augmenting technical progress, Hicks neutral, which is jointly labor and capital augmenting, and Solow neutral, which is only capital augmenting. The framework I'm going to present shows how these different forms of technical progress can all be incorporated in. I'm only going to have time to show you the one that's most important, the Harrod neutral labor augmenting. But if you put Hicks neutral in, you do get some interesting outcomes. And what's interesting about them, they differ across the type of growth model you're using. And this is that's a reason to think about it. And by the way, I think it's a reason to pay more attention to Hicks neutral than we do, because I think it's probably the bulk of technical progress. It's that's sort of I know it comes out of the Solow growth accounting framework. Solow in 57 found, I think, 87%. Everyone revised it down thereafter, but it's still the lion's share of technical progress. And we use aggregate production functions, so it's going to apply to us a little bit too. So let's start with the starting point of is a description of the production function and the expansion of productive capacity, which is the core of growth theory. Since the production function is located within the firm, that is why the firm is the locus of the growth process. Both Keynesian and neoclassical growth theory agree on that. Where they disagree is on what determines firms' willingness to accumulate capital and what restricts the accumulation of capital. So production I'm going to work with is described by a Leontief fixed coefficients linear production function, and it can exhibit all 3 types of technical progress. That's what this expression there is doing. Firms are assumed to be efficient, and that means they do not accumulate unnecessary capital or employ unnecessary labor. That's one of the things where I've turned against the Neo-Kaletskian model. It's basically there's a lack of efficiency in the firms. The growth of output of supply is then given by that expression there. And since firms are efficient, one side I'll explain it. Since firms are efficient, growth of supply requires balanced growth of output from capital with output from labor. That's the necessary for the fixed coefficients production. So the center expression in equation 1 determines the growth of output from capital. You have basically Hicks neutral technical progress. The B is solo neutral technical progress, and the K is the growth of the capital stock. And on the labor side, you get growth of output from Hicks neutral technical progress, Harrod neutral labor augmenting technical progress, and growth of employment. And the two must balance out. And if you have this framework, you have actually 8 technical progress regimes, ranging from a situation of no technical progress to a regime with all types of technical progress. And what I have here in figure 2 shows the supply function under 3 different assumptions. The Keynesian firm produces to demand so that the growth of supply is equal to the growth of demand. The rate of supply growth is determined by the rate of capital accumulation and the character of technical progress. And that means that growth is both an extensive growth phenomena and an intensive growth phenomena. If you have no technical progress, starting at the bottom, and Harrod neutral technical, then it turns out that no technical progress and Harrod neutral technical progress produce the same production function, the dynamic supply function. That's because the effects of Harrod technical progress all are felt in the labor market, where you're growing effective labor supply. Hicks neutral and solo neutral technical progress both shift the supply growth function up and produce faster output growth. Just a little jump ahead a little bit to the labor market here. As regards employment growth, it can be positively or negatively affected by technical progress. Hicks neutral progress has no effect. Harrod neutral progress can lower employment growth because you've got more labor supply coming out of technology, so you may not need to actually employ as many people. And solo neutral progress actually increases employment growth because you're putting more capital, even if the firm's not investing, it's acquiring through the technical progress process more capital, and therefore it needs more workers in this fixed coefficients world. Now, in figure 1, Hicks-Harrod solo neutral technical progress provides the fastest supply growth because firms are getting the boost of both Hicksian generalized technical progress and Solovian technical progress, which increases the effective supply of capital. Thereafter comes Hicks-Harrod neutral, and at the bottom is a standalone Harrod neutral technical progress, which is actually the same as a no technical progress within the firm, as it were. Okay. One way of summing up what's going on here in terms of this figure 1, Hicks and solo neutral technical progress shift the supply function up. What Harrod neutral technical progress is going to do is allow you to move along the diagram bit and get further up these dynamic supply growth curves than you would be able to otherwise. Now I'm going to bypass the question of what type of technical progress prevails. That is a question of high theory and beyond the scope of the paper, but it does connect with some of my final comments, which are a little critical about growth theory, and particularly about the use of steady state equilibrium theory, which we do. Basically, solo neutral technical progress is ruled out by the steady state assumption and what it applies about different things. So since in my view the world is not steady state, that seems to be worth questioning. But for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to work with Harrod neutral technical progress. Now, so the previous section described the internal equilibrium of the firm, which is the locus of growth. This section, I'm now going to turn to the goods market, which is another block of the economy in which households and firms participate. Firms' participation is via investment and capital accumulation, which then feeds back into the production process in the way that I've just described. Households participate via saving and consumption, which then connects back to the labor supply and the labor market. I'm not going to have anything to say about that. It's a story in of itself. As regards the goods market, post-Keynesian theory is splintered between the 3 approaches: the Neo-Kletskin approach, the Cambridge classical approach, and the super multiplier approach. And they've been talked in and out in various talks during the course of the session. But here's an important point. The three theories are united in having growth be demand-led. At the same time, as I'm going to show, they have very different economic structures and identify quite different economic mechanisms that I think are incompatible. I think that's the sense in the room too. And that's why I'm going to say there's no single post-Keynesian theory. One can talk of a post-Keynesian perspective on growth, but one cannot talk about a unified post-Keynesian theory of growth. Figure 2 provides a graphic. I'm not going to go into these at all. You know them anyway. It's sort of, this is what you teach your students. The graphic representations of the neo-Kaleckian model, in the middle, the Cambridge classical model, and to your right, the superplier multiplier. The three figures all show the process of determining the goods market equilibrium via the process of balancing saving and investment. This is common across all of them. In the neo-Kaleckian model, it's the rate of capacity utilization that adjusts to achieve saving investment balance. In the Cambridge model, it's the profit rate that adjusts to its yield saving investment balance. And in the super multiplier model, the adjustment is achieved by a bit more of a complex process that basically brings the growth of autonomous demand per unit of capital into alignment with the rate of capital accumulation. And there the autonomous demand lowers the saving rate measured relative to the capital stock. If the saving rate is then less than the investment rate, the capital stock starts increasing, and then faster than autonomous demand growth, thereby bringing them down to this point of intersection. Reverse holds here. Now, a quick comparison of the three models. The three growth models are all demand-led, but with very different theoretical properties. And I think those properties are summarized here. The differences in properties concern capacity utilization and the theory of income distribution. The neo-Kaleckian model assumes long-run capacity utilization is variable. It is consistent with either a Kaleckian markup pricing theory of distribution or an institutionalist theory that the Sraffians like. With the former, the markup being the one that is used more. But they sort of go back and forth between, not terribly clear about that. The Cambridge model assumes long-run capacity utilization is equal to the exogenously given normal rate, and it uses Kaldor's Cambridge theory of income distribution to close it. The super multiplier model assumes long-run capacity utilization is equal to the exogenously given normal rate, and I think it's consistent with all three theories of distribution. I'm not absolutely sure about it. What we see this, but not the Kaldorian, but I think it could be the way that you can, maybe someone will help me figure that out, but I don't think there's an inconsistency having the goods market get closed somehow, in equilibrium that is, by also adjusting the income shares. But maybe it may be overdetermined in that case. That occurs to me now. The super multiplier model has an overlap with the neo-Kaleckian model regarding theory of income distribution, but not capacity utilization. It has an overlap with the Cambridge model regarding both regarding capacity utilization and maybe regarding income distribution. But income distribution matters for growth in the neo-Kaleckian and Cambridge models, but it has no impact in the super multiplier model. And that is, because growth is determined by expected demand growth, and that's independent of distribution. These are very significant theoretical differences between them. Growth is endogenously determined in the this is an important point. It's endogenously determined in the neo-Kaleckian and Cambridge models, but I think it's exogenously demand-led in the super multiplier model. I think Steve's sections there about the adaptive model are the way of feeding some endogeneity into the super multiplier model. Which approach is better is obviously a question of theoretical judgment. As of now, at least in the northern hemisphere, the Neo-Keynesian approach is more popular, obviously not here. I would argue that that popularity is really for political reasons. This is a time of wage stagnation and increased income inequality, and the Neo-Keynesian's possibility of wage-led growth is very politically appealing. It means higher wages are compatible with faster growth, and the Cambridge model has growth being profit-led, while the super multiplier model says growth is unaffected by wages. So I think it's politics that's really driving the popularity of it. That's what I sort of felt when trying to talk to trade unions and the ILO. It's not theory, and I think it'll come back to haunt people. I've been a little bit unhappy with this in the varieties of capitalism literature that I've sort of begun to participate in a little bit. All the political scientists aren't aware of the discussions that are going on here, but they've taken on board the Neo-Keynesian model, the growth regimes thing, as their way of doing political science. And I think that it'll be exposed, and then that whole way of thinking will come under scrutiny with weakness. So you really need to make good choices when you start doing this stuff. Anyway, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to use the super multiplier model. Okay, now let's turn to the labor market. And this is where sort of my contribution has been. Everything I've said before has been the contribution of others. Maybe I hope I've just given some few additional insights that can help you appreciate it. Let me say to motivate the need for it, consider the structure. So for this, motivate the need for some comments on the labor market here. What is the structure we have so far? We have a goods market and a production process within the firm. In that type of world, growth can be endogenously demand-led. There's absolutely no supply restrictions on how fast the economy can grow. And that doesn't seem to me reasonable. Incorporating the supply side then involves incorporating the labor market. And it is the labor market is the driver behind this accommodating supply process that Steve talks about. And I think it fills in the black box of accommodating supply. The labor market is a restriction on what is possible. It's a critical source of accommodating supply, and it imposes a balance condition since the unemployment rate cannot be explosive up or down. Let's turn to modeling the labor market. There are basically two core equations. One equation, the top one there, equation called equation 2, defines the unemployment rate, and the second equation defines the rate of change of the unemployment rate. And the labor market balance condition is when GU, the rate of change of the labor market, is 0. That is the Keynesian balance construct of equilibrium, as opposed to the full employment market clearing construct of equilibrium. The labor force growth I'm going to talk about is exogenous, though I will sort of have a few comments on that. Employment growth is determined within the firm. It's determined by the production needs via the production function, and it therefore depends on the mix of technical progress, which is why I spent some time working through the different possibilities. The second critical component of the labor market is the technical progress function, which originated Caldo, I think it's a 1961 paper, and can of course therefore be traced back to Verdun. Caldo comes at that's the culmination of his work, and it doesn't work out because he puts the growth of demand or stuff, he ends up with a way of closing it in a way that you can have a frontier with a choice of possible growth rates. Here I have a technical progress function that depends negatively on the unemployment rate. When the unemployment rate goes up, then firms will have less incentive to search out labor. This is the labor augmenting technical progress function. They'll have less incentive to search out labor augmenting advances. It depends positively on the growth of demand. As the demand growth accelerates, firms are going to be looking for ways of finding more ways of efficiently providing for that demand, and it's negatively impacted by the profit share. Maybe easier to think about that in terms of an increase in the profit share means a decline in the wage share, which means less urgency within the firm. If there's some sort of cost to finding these innovations, that's going to decrease the incentive to look for labor augmenting technical progress. So tight labor market conditions, a low unemployment rate, induce firms to seek ways of improving productivity growth, labor productivity. Buoyant demand growth induces firms to seek productivity gains that can meet the faster demand growth. A high profit share implies a low wage share, which reduces the incentive for firms to search for labor augmenting technical progress. If you substitute the expression for employment and the technical progress function into equation 4, you then get the equation of motion, the reduced form equation of motion for the unemployment rate. And the differential equation is stable if unemployment reduces the rate of technical progress. As long as you have this effect when the unemployment rate goes up, the rate of technical progress or labor augmenting technical progress comes down. So labor augmenting, now rather odd here, labor augmenting technical progress increases the unemployment rate by this labor supply effect, which prima facie seems bad, but it's not. In a growth context, it provides the extra labor that the economy needs to grow. And if the technical progress function is therefore at the heart of the accommodating supply black box, and demand growth also operates through the technical progress function. Demand growth has 3 effects on the unemployment rate. First, it directly reduces unemployment by increasing capital accumulation. Because faster demand calls for more capital given the Leontief production function. I think of this as the classic Keynesian effect. Second, it directly spurs technical progress through the GD effect. And then third, it indirectly spurs technical progress by bringing down the unemployment rate. And so those 2 effects accelerate effective labor supply growth, enabling the economy to grow faster. And it's the latter 2 effects that are the accommodating supply effects. And they work through the technical progress function. If you set that equal to 0, the equation of motion, to get the steady state, you get the expression for U star, where you see that faster labor force growth increases the equilibrium unemployment rate. Faster demand growth has an ambiguous impact. On one hand, there's the Keynesian demand effect, which increases labor demand growth and reduces the unemployment rate. On the other hand, there are the 2 Harrod-neutral technical progress effects, which increase labor supply growth and increase the unemployment rate. And if the Keynesian effect dominates, then the unemployment rate will go down as a result of faster demand growth. It can still go down if the Keynesian effect is slightly smaller, but is helped by. No, I have to think that through. Let me see. Here we go. Here in this figure here, what we've just done is a figure. We've derived the expression for the steady state unemployment rate as a function of the growth of aggregate demand. And that, therefore, in a way, gives us what I call the unemployment rate demand growth frontier. And it can be represented, shown here. It's the equilibrium unemployment rate associated with each rate of demand growth. And so as you vary the rate of demand growth, you can slide up or down the frontier. And figure 4 here, shows 3 potential frontiers. Figure 4, actually, by the way, let me say here, I think this frontier is what you are tacitly estimating. Okay. Figure 4 shows a linear frontier in which the marginal impact of demand growth on the unemployment rate is constant. and we want to understand what's going on here. Being above the frontier corresponds to a disequilibrium situation in which demand growth is too fast for the current unemployment rate, so that the unemployment rate starts falling. Being below corresponds to a disequilibrium situation in which demand growth is insufficient to maintain the existing unemployment rate, so that the unemployment rate starts increasing. Figure 4 Figure 4, I've got figure 4A here. Figure 4B shows a non-linear frontier which hits a ceiling. The economic logic of the non-linearity is as follows. Starting with a high unemployment rate, firms have a pool of technical progress innovation opportunities, and they pick the low-hanging fruit. And the opportunities for technical advance are as you, when we have high unemployment rate, there's a little incentive because there's a lot of labor available. As you start to move along the curve, then you're going to have more incentive to find innovations. You take all the low-hanging fruit, and the unemployment rate is also decreasing. So gradually the curve then flattens out, and as unemployment so that as you start to harvest all the low-hanging fruit, the opportunities for finding productive sources of labor productivity growth start to decline, and eventually the curve can become flat if the further falls in the unemployment rate have no impact at all on the technical progress function. At that stage, you hit a plateau, and that basically then defines a ceiling for the economy. What I call GD max is the rate of demand growth. If the rate of demand growth exceeds GD max, then demand growth exceeds total effective labor supply growth, and the system becomes unstable. At this stage, above GD max, the system can no longer generate sufficient accommodating supply response. Now, the importance of this framing is there is therefore a ceiling to what demand growth can accomplish regarding increasing growth. And that is a critical feature of the proposed general framework that I'm offering here. I think PK models of demand-led growth suffer from the implausible claim that there is no ceiling to demand growth. If you take the models strictly as they're presented, there is no ceiling. And so the proposed framework is to say that there really is. The ceiling depends on the growth of the labor force and the strength of the demand growth induced labor augmenting technical progress, which is the accommodating supply mechanism. The critical questions are: how high is the ceiling, and how large is the zone of the negative slope? By the way, again, I think that if you this framework here, I haven't read your latest paper with the econometrics in it, but it does seem to me you have to estimate this with two-stage least squares, because there's a back and forth between the unemployment rate and the growth rate, and OLS is going to give you biased standard errors. Also, I don't like the 5-year average approach, because this is a thing that's going on prime. It should be in time. There may be some lags of effect, etc. But 5-year averages, you're beginning to hide things, and things may be getting conflated. This should be estimated through time series, in my opinion. By the way, figure 4C here shows a horizontal frontier, which describes Harrod's 1939 classical article that jump-started modern growth theory. Effective supply growth is exogenously determined by the rate of labor force growth and the exogenously given labor augmenting technical progress, which together yield the natural rate of growth. That creates a knife-edge situation whereby demand must grow at exactly that rate to prevent the unemployment rate either exploding upwards or downwards. Note, there's no natural rate, at least according to my reading, there's no natural rate of unemployment in Harrod's framework. All that is required is that you be on this equilibrium horizontal frontier. So you have to pick the exact rate of demand growth, but then where you are here depends on, it can be consistent with any unemployment rate. I think that speaks to the generality of this framework that this was able to fit in. And in a way, you can think of the Solo's neoclassical growth rate as a particular point on that, because he's now imposed there is somewhere along here a labor market clearing equilibrium. It's one of an infinite possibilities, and Solo says we find that one. So again, you can put the neoclassical model into this model too, which I like. So we're now ready to assemble the whole act with firms, the production process, and the labor market. Again, I emphasize it's a general framework, not a general theory, and I'm going to do it with the super multiplier model. And it's very simple. You start the super multiplier framework, add it in with these other pieces. You've now got a three-piece model that works very well. The bottom left side panel shows the super multiplier goods market. The top left side panel shows the firm's growth supply function under the assumption of Harrod neutral technical progress. And the top right side panel shows the labor market unemployment rate demand growth frontier. The economy exhibits endogenous demand-led growth, as indicated by the arrows. The direction of causation runs from the goods market, then on into the firm, and thereafter into the labor market. And I don't think we do. I think I'll skip sort of the working through it. Got your demand, determines what the firm then determines capital. I'll skip through it, and then I'll immediately do it. You determine your capital accumulation. The capital accumulation determines the growth of supply. The capital accumulation also determines the equilibrium unemployment rate. Now, the model can then be used to examine some comparative static experiments. The figure here, figure 5, illustrates the effect of an increase in the rate of autonomous demand growth. You just shift the very easy to understand. I think you could probably teach this. You can use this to teach this to seniors, not introductory economics, but certainly. And I think you can teach it in a graduate class as well, so that they can simply and easily understand. And maybe it might even spur some research. You shift the investment function to the right. Obviously, a new equilibrium in the goods market ends up with a lower autonomous demand per unit of capital. You move along the supply function now. You get a faster growth of output within the firm, and you also bring down the unemployment rate, because with faster capital growth, you move up the frontier to a higher point. But again, the important point here is that demand growth cannot be pushed without limit, owing to the ceiling in the labor market. Now, a second experiment is an increase in the profit share. It would shift the saving function. It would shift the increase saving, shift it to the right, which would increase equilibrium autonomous demand per unit of capital. Other than that, there's no effect on growth, because distribution does not affect demand growth, which is the driver of the outcome in the super multiplier model. The complete separation of growth and income distribution is the appealing feature to Sraffian economists, which explains why the approach is popular with them. However, though there is no profit share, and this is where the model gets useful, though there's no profit share effect on growth, there is an effect in the labor market. Remember, I had the profit share being one of the potential drivers in the technical progress function. So that's going to reduce the incentive for labor augmenting technical progress. That's going to reduce effective labor supply growth, which is going to shift the labor market frontier leftward. Consequently, the equilibrium unemployment rate is going to decrease as a result of this increase in the profit share. A higher profit share reduces equilibrium unemployment because it reduces effective labor supply growth while leaving labor demand, while leaving demand growth unchanged. So I don't know if you like that or not, but because I know my neo-Kaleckian colleagues would hate that. Anything that profit does, that's good. And I find that odd, because if you're a Marxist or anything like, profit has a very important function in the development of capitalism. And so to be so down on profit all the time, it seems to me you're not understanding capitalism. A third experiment is an increase in labor force growth, and that can be due to increased population growth, an increased rate of immigration, a secular trend increase in the labor force participation, and these things can run for decades. So that's why I'm willing to consider them. And this is where steady state gets in your way. They can't be a steady state that runs for an infinite amount of time. But labor force participation increased in the US for 30 years. So it's for, if you want to understand growth, in the long run, this is where in the long run, we're all dead really begins to come into growth theory. Steady state is taking us to a space that I don't think we want to be. So faster labor force growth shifts the labor market frontier up. If demand growth is unchanged, the unemployment rate will increase. That holds very important lessons. Large immigration flows can increase unemployment unless demand growth policy adjusts to accommodate them. So you've got supply accommodation, and you've got to have on the other side demand accommodation of supply developments. It's these two sides you've got to work with. There must be demand side accommodation to meet supply side developments, just as supply side accommodation is needed to meet demand side developments. Anyway, I did mention I'm not going to don't have time to do the Higgs neutral thing, but there are some interesting little twists that I wasn't aware of and was surprised to find. How much time do I have left? Okay. I want to finish now by turning first with some suggestions for future research, and then with some critical comments of our collective paradigm that we work with. A first major opportunity here is to extend and expand the variable set impacting the technological progress function, which is the heart of the endogenous growth process. This is the route mainstream economics has already gone down, albeit not framing it and acknowledging it in terms of Kaldor's technical progress function. This is another case of intellectual theft by the mainstream. And it offers an avenue for introducing a wide range, potentially, of socioeconomic forces. One variable already introduced by Fazzani and Zamparelli is R&D expenditures. Education could be in there, healthcare could be in there, other social variables such as trust and honesty might be included. To the extent that these variables are then impacted by policy, that creates new policy openings to impact growth. I think it's a really a rich set. There's also likely to be background demand side effects from such variables if their financing impacts balance sheets. And I think that line of reasoning has already appeared a little bit in the work of Kim and Setterfield, and I think Gilberto has done a paper on human capital accumulation with debt effects. Now, one pitfall connected in discussion connects to the discussion in previous section is the metric of these variables, and this is where I fell foul with my work in the 1990s. It didn't work out as I intended. In general, rate of flow variables, e.g. spending on education per unit of capital, are more suitable than stock ratio variables, human capital per worker. That is because stock ratios increase over time, which would counterfactually suggest the rate of labor augmenting technical progress is accelerating over time. So you have to be careful what type of metric, of the variable you put inside this technical progress. All of those developments fit within this proposed framework. The great virtues of the framework is it makes clear how those variables impact the work, how the impacts of the variables work. Their growth impacts will always depend on two features. First, the type of technical change that is spurred. If they spur Higgs neutral technical progress, there will be output gains. If they only spur labor augmenting technical progress, they will increase the unemployment rate by shifting the labor frontier. There may also be accompanying income distribution effects that impact growth via the demand side. However, that will depend on the nature of the demand side specification. Now, a second suggestion for future research is the role of the corporation in shaping growth. The corporation is the most powerful and important institution in capitalism, and it needs to be surfaced more in growth models. As I said earlier, PK models had that via the construct of the managerial firm, with the managerial firm having a particular objective function, thereby affecting the investment function and capital accumulation. I think that line of reasoning has fallen away and become invisible. Let's bring it back. In my understanding of the world, the modern corporation plays the role of the bourgeoisie in Marx or the entrepreneur in Schumpeter. And it is the source of creative destruction, which is so important to growth and overall economic outcomes. And here's the important point. The behavior of the corporation is impacted by laws and power structures governing the corporation. Those strains of impact should be incorporated into the growth theory and fit with the varieties of capitalism logic. A third suggestion is the issue of how artificial intelligence and intelligent robotics will affect growth. Is AI just a matter of Kaleckian functional income distribution? The profit share goes up, the wage share goes down, some sort of mechanism like that? Or is it something more? My sense, it is a lot more, not just a little bit more. There's a hell of a lot more to it. And it's something different, and PK models don't seem to me well equipped to handle it, given the existing production function approach. And so I think I've explored all the possibilities with the different types of technical progress, and it's not going to fit in anywhere nicely there. There could be capital augmenting or something like that, so there is some possibility, but it's going to be a bit of a squeeze to make it work. Okay, let me turn with my conclusions with concerns about. My first conclusion, what I reiterate, is there is no post-Keynesian general theory of growth, and there is actually, and nor is there really a coherent, uniform post-Keynesian economics. PK economics is a collection of heterodox economics perspectives. Each perspective may be internally consistent, but across perspectives, there are significant differences. They can share a meta-compatibility, for instance, a belief in demand-led growth, but the specific theories are inconsistent or even contradictory. That's clearly illustrated by growth theory, which is marked by different theories of capital accumulation and different theories of income distribution. And there are a lot of other controversies and differences outside of growth theory that would just mean even more difference. So anyone claiming to represent PK economics is engaged in attempted appropriation of the post-Keynesian label. For themselves, that is. A second concern is that post-Keynesian growth theory is now getting into the realm of diminishing returns, rather theory of demand-led growth. I'm a bit apprehensive about this. As an editor of a journal, we see that there's a lot of empirical papers on wage-led growth. I mean, every country, etc., and even in the modeling stuff. It's becoming a bit of a cottage industry in which inputs are added into the technical progress function, and you then grind through the comparative static exercises about how to increase growth by increasing those inputs. Or alternatively, complexities are borrowed from macroeconomics and just added to the demand side, and those complexities are argued to affect growth just as they affected the level of demand. I'm not unsure how productive that research is, and here's my real point. I don't think it's the best use of very scarce progressive research resources in a very troubled time where there's need for research on other more pressing political economic issues. But then I live outside of the academy, and so I feel that more, and I'm more sensitive to it than perhaps if you're in an economics department. A third concern is the intellectual foundations of post-Keynesian growth theory. There's a proverb that says, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And that raises a concern whether post-Keynesian economics is imitating neoclassical growth too much. whether it has lost sight of the original Cambridge critiques that motivated the quest for an alternative growth theory. We should recall that the critique of the aggregate production function and aggregate capital, plus the issues of equilibrium versus history, were original motivations. However, post-Keynesian growth theory now ignores all of that and uses all those neoclassical features. To me, and perhaps the one I want to do the most on in future work, and I'm trying to pepper people to be receptive to it, because if I challenge this, I'm implicitly probably challenging everyone in the room, because you all use those features, and people don't like to be challenged. The use of steady state methodology is especially problematic. Steady state equilibrium is the way equilibrium is modeled in an expanding world. However, steady state thinking runs counter to concern with history, which is supposed to be a hallmark of post-Keynesian economics. Worse yet, steady state assumption does violence to the phenomenon it is trying to explain. Growth maybe, I think probably is, substantially the product of non-equilibrium processes. This connects a little bit to Heinz's lecture yesterday. So Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction is fundamentally non-equilibrium, and it is fundamentally important to understanding growth. It is the engine of technological and organizational change that powers both productivity advance and capital accumulation in the form of, it shows up in the form of capital accumulation in the form of new vintages of capital. So where does that lead us? I'm not arguing for the abandonment of steady state growth theory and steady state modeling. To me, steady state models are useful, even if the world is not steady state. They provide a framework for organizing thinking about the economy, which I hope is evidenced even by this paper. We're using steady state here, but we may have got some understanding of the world. But and ironically, though these steady state models they claim to describe a steady state world, they can still be useful for understanding a non-steady state world. That is because the things that they cannot handle are the things that might be going on in the real world. So if it can't fit into a steady state model, it's not a reason, maybe it's a reason to reject the model rather than the thing. Thus, they cannot handle a falling rate of profit due to rising capital intensity of production. But that is exactly what might be going on with AI and intelligent robotics. That usefulness illustrates the importance of using multiple modalities in coming to grips with the complexity of growth. But I would say there is a need to end the monopoly of steady state modeling and add other modes of inquiry and thinking. There is a need for more theoretical work showing the weaknesses of steady state reasoning and how it can misrepresent the world. And this is the really important point. I think those misrepresentations can have very deleterious political economic consequences for society. And this is what I'm working on now, is if you have a steady state view of the world, the structure of the world can't change. But I'm interested in other economic systems that would make life better for people, and would it deal with things that we now call the poly crisis. We're stuck here, and I sent Steve this paper before, it's motivating something. I think we're stuck with a capitalism that is really developing crises, each of which would correspond as true Marxist crises: stagnation, income inequality, AI, robotics and jobs, not just climate change, an ecological crisis. Okay, multiple margins of nature are being violated in a way that life will become very difficult. We've got a problem of imperialism and militarism. Each of these are enough to disrupt and require a reset of society in a most fundamental way. And so I think that if you want to put onto the table, you want to table new ways of organizing society, maybe still capitalist. I'm moving more in a socialist direction and very extreme social democracy. Then you've got to get rid of the steady state, because the steady state way of thinking becomes an obstruction to tabling new economic arrangements. So be open to that type of thinking, especially if I send you a paper about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you both. So we now have some time for a round of questions. We have one here, another, three. Okay.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Fazzani. I must say I found your paper really provocative because I'm currently meddling with these debt limits questions, and I actually presented a paper in the conference regarding the burden of the debt in a functional finance framework, which I think we should debate this a lot because it concerns the application of Keynesian policy revolution in nowadays. And I would like to raise 3 points that raised my attention. The first one was provocative number 3, right, about the if we raise the rate of growth of public spending, it's not clear if it's going to raise the share of government spending in the economy, and which means perhaps raising the spending is not going to become a deficit spending, right? If we maintain the same tax rate to the economy, and but this assumes that you made the case for what's necessary for that to happen. But I was also thinking that we need to assume that the multiplier effects follow the average, at least, of these spending, because public spending can assume many forms, right? And these can have many different multipliers effects. And if we have a preoccupation with deficits, then we must seek the higher multiplier spending as possible. So spending with poor people, that's going to increase demand, and avoid spending with rich people. So there would be a case for selecting these. But if we aren't preoccupied with the MMT case, who cares about the deficit spending, then, and we see that there is no cost at spending, then once we reach a rate of growth of public spending that gets the full employment, then we could expand even more our spending with rich people because they wouldn't spend their money. And this raises a very disturbing consequence of functional finance, that at the full employment rate of growth of spending, we can spend more with rich people, but not with poor people. And this is in the framework of functional finance. And this leads me to the second point, is that I loved your example of an economy that has no taxation and the public debt converges to, it's not explosive. In Brazil, that wouldn't be much the case because we have, in the last decades, the rate of interest higher than growth. But in the US, even in the US, that the growth is bigger than the rate of interest, if we assume the MMT case of who cares and I can spend with lots of people that won't spend their money, then if I expanded the deficit, please, I have to make my point. Then if I spend a lot with and raise the deficit a lot, I would have a big debt in the United States, and this wouldn't have any consequence. In your paper, you put that there would be inflationary consequences, or perhaps a politically unacceptability of the enormous debt of a big state without any taxes. And what is this political unacceptability of the debt? Because if it is unacceptable, how do we frame this unacceptability? Then we would have to care and refute the MMT not caring about the debt, and which would pose a cost to them. It's not that, oh, then we must cut out all the spending, but there would be some kind of cost to be taken into account on deficit spending. And this leads to my final point. Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks to both to Steve. I think this connecting to the simulation, the growth when you have an increase in government spending. So the simulation rests on the idea that government spending is non-capacity creating. So something that we were discussing earlier. If public investment does create productive capacity, then the negative effect on the debt to GDP ratio will be even more persistent or higher because, you know, the output level will increase, so the ratio will go down. To Tom, well, I have first a clarifying question, something probably very simple that I didn't quite get about the derivation of the growth of supply equation, your equation 1. Because if we use a Leontief production function, then the growth rate of supply should be given by the growth rate of the relatively scarcer input of production. If it's labor, the growth rate of supply is given by the growth rate of employment plus productivity growth. So I didn't get how we get both the growth rate of capital and labor in that equation. And well, on the properties of demand-led growth model, so normal capacity and endogenous distribution, but probably not of the model structure, one can just as well formulate a growth model, a Cambridge growth model with exogenous distribution and flexible capacity utilization. And then very last point, and I'm done. I will tend to disagree that Khaled in the global north, from a gringo perspective, looking at conferences around the world, I think that the super multiplier papers are much more frequently presented than Kaleckian models. So we should probably conclude, paraphrasing Milton Friedman, that we are all Serranian now.
Well, thank you, the two of you, two very nice presentations. For Tom, one problem with your inverted S unemployment rate, demand growth frontier, is that it seems implausible that when the unemployment rate approaches 0, you would not have this, you have this flat behavior of productivity growth. So I would expect that as you approach full employment, that would speed up the rate of growth of productivity. And second, supply side matters. I agree with you. But then we should go beyond the labor market. For instance, infrastructure is also key. Energy is also key. So maybe the exclusive focus on the labor market is makes for an incomplete taking out take on the supply side. And then for Steve, there is a huge discussion in Brazil on the reduction of the working day. The work week would fall a few hours. So how can we appraise the implications in a demand-led growth of this that will make for a tighter labor constraint, or should we be for this kind of a reduction, or what's your take on this issue?
Tom, what do you think to incorporate in your model the idea that a dual labor market or segmented labor market, because there is a lot of differences, you know, the impact of the employment rate on different groups of labor, and the reaction is completely different. And this is an old tradition institutionalist in American, but nowadays I don't see a lot of this. Why is it? Because I think that we are having big problems with the labor market. It's not a homogeneous consideration.
I suppose I start. Is it Adrian? Adrian, thank you. I actually heard your talk. It was good on fiscal policy. So it's a good point, actually. I think you're right. I mean, I emphasize the debt to GDP ratio. That was kind of the organizing idea, and the idea that if you raise the growth rate of government spending and the government share falls, the GDP ratio might not fall. And I actually don't know exactly on a case-by-case basis what happens to deficit, but what you say makes sense, which is if the government, if the tax rate stays the same and the government spending share goes down, the deficit should go down. So that seems right. What else do I have here? The idea of the size of the multiplier. So again, I didn't present the model. I was talking about the policy. In the model, you have the super multiplier, and so if it's big, but these are level effects, not growth effects in the dynamics in this context. And so a change in something that would change the multiplier overall would, at least if it's permanent, would change the permanent level of output, move the growth path up or down, but not change the growth rate. That would be at least the simple story in this context. I think if you have government spending leading to capacity, I'd have to think a bit more about that. And if it's capacity creating government spending, you're expanding the supply side. So the kind of question is, how does that accommodate on the demand side? The adjustment process is pretty robust, so I think it would probably work. In which case, you could have at least a positive level of. If we lower the work week, so I'm glad we had one more question, so I could think about it for 10 seconds, in terms of how it works out. I can think about it most easily if I think of that as a slowing in the growth of labor supply. So in other words, a tendency for the work week to slow down in a kind of continuous way. And that would lower the well, at the end, you're going to be growing at the level of autonomous demand. So you'd have to have an accommodation through the unemployment rate that would adjust. And it's late. It's been a long conference. I can't do it in my head, but it's certainly something that we could look at. I did want to make one. I know we're late. Maybe I don't. Moving beyond the labor market, which is a comment for Tom. In the model that's behind what I was talking about, the limit in the maximum growth rate that was related to what Tom was talking about, an almost identical diagram, is the minimum unemployment rate. And again, it's the labor market becomes a constraint. Now, when I keep thinking about that, it's a sense of it's people. Everything else is produced. We produce capital, we produce infrastructure. Not to say that this is simple and or that it's quick, but in the end, it seems like what the true limit on these kinds of models is ultimately the willingness of people to work.
Okay, Ettore first. Let me start with the easiest part. Empirically, what's more popular amongst the gringos? My points of contact with them are through the political economy growth regimes world, and also through the FMM. And so those are two centers of sort of neo-Kaletskianism. So that's why. But your co-author, Mark Setterfield, is much more into neo-Kaletskian models, is my impression. Yeah, okay. And you are too. So, okay, all right. So, so that's why I said it. But it seemed to me it was one of my stylized facts that may not be one of your stylized facts. What about in the technical progress, the growth of the capital stock isn't there. It's the growth of demand. But it is the same as the growth of supply, because the Keynesian firm produces to demand, and the growth of capital is equal to the growth of demand because of the super multiplier model, the expected rate of demand. We're talking when it's all settled down, you've got Keynesian stability, you don't have Herodian instability, then it's going to be the growth of demand that is the driver of steady state. So I think that's logically correct. Gilberto, when you get, I have to distinguish here between levels and marginal effects. When you get to a very low unemployment rate, your rate of labor augmenting technical progress is already very fast. You've moved all that way. So they're just not that, and it's going on every period after period. They're just not the same opportunities that they were before. And that's what causes the flattening out. it stops increasing, but it remains very high. And then I also think there might be, this would have to be more hand waving, because it'd be hard to incorporate in a sort of model. There might be things called bottlenecks that might actually impede labor augmenting technologies. I believe bottlenecks are very important. And I've always worked with multi-sector economies for that reason. They're very important for understanding inflation. I think they could be important for understanding growth. And though I here have a do it by functional analysis, there's some, this could actually map back into Joan Robinson's world a little bit. When you're on the flat side of the S curve, high unemployment, you're in a leaden age. When you get onto the positively sloped, the negatively sloped portion of it, you're in a golden age. And when you're on the flat stage, you're in a platinum age. And then you could actually, if it falls back, actually at high unemployment, at very low unemployment rates, if there's bottlenecks that disrupt the innovation process for whatever reason, then you could actually have a falling off of the maximum rate of growth. And I in some of the talky section of the paper, I have that in there. To Carlos, well, I think the sort of dualism and sort of going back to Lewis models of the 1950s, that's in the labor force participation question. Really, though, this type of model says, and it's applicable to a Lewis world, what you have is you can keep shifting population from the countryside to the bright lights, and that's so you have your labor force growth. You may not you can have the labor force growth is then on demand. Labor force growth will be equal to whatever is needed to balance the labor market for during the period in which you have that pool of rural labor to draw upon. And so that's how I might apply this to China. That model is that China for 30 years is now getting to the end of the process. It's run out of rural labor. I think there's still some there. There's more. The Go West stuff is all about that, not just for political economy reasons, but there's actually untapped resources, labor resources in there. But yeah. Shout.
General labor law, the different aspects, different aspects of
I don't know, that's pushing it to your infrastructure. Let me join your comment to the infrastructure comment that I didn't say. There was this great talk earlier today by a man called by Professor Lima, and I'm going to invoke the Lima rule. That, this is just what I'm talking about right now. You can have it as a model, and you can suggest maybe the thought for future research. Actually, with infrastructure. with the Lima rule. With infrastructure, it's difficult because infrastructure is used for civilian consumption purposes as well as for productive purposes. Do you want to put another type of capital into the production function, then which becomes, I don't think so. I don't think you're going to get very much extra mileage. You're going to get a lot of messiness. And what is the binding constraint? Does infrastructure really bind on the production firm? It seems that I do believe infrastructure is very important for growth. So that it is a question worth considering, but not today. And is that it? Yeah, I wanted to make some comments, 2 comments to Steve. I am quite concerned about the debt, unlike yourself, and I think it links a little bit to was it Kai who talked about the fiscal policy in the session before. The way debt works to me is that everything is fine as long as you've got some space within your credit limit. Like, think of your credit card. And the day before, everything is fine. But the day you hit the ceiling, your transaction gets turned down, it can be pretty embarrassing. And it gets a lot worse for a country. And I think actually this is very Minskian and so on. The public debt may be subject to some Minskian features as well. We've only applied Minsky to the private debt, but maybe someone should think of applying Minsky to public debt. I think the logic may be there. And I do think that debt does have an effect on R, but it may be, again, one of these S-shaped curves, but very, very flat for a long period of time, and then whoops. And that was what Dornbusch used to say. The crisis takes longer than you ever thought it would to happen, but when it happens faster than you ever thought it could. And I think that's very wise advice for thinking about public debt. And I have to emphasize that there's a difference. I think this is where MMT people go astray. They confuse or conflate bankruptcy and debt issues. We can never go bankrupt if you issue in your own currency, because you can always pay it off. But throwing debt, issuing debt, and increasing the stock of debt will have consequences. And that's what they have no theory of, because they don't have a portfolio theory. They don't have any way of saying what happens to the liabilities that they are injecting into the economy. And lastly, what counts as autonomous investment? I was running through, I think, of sort of discretionary government spending, social spending, things, your social security, my social security. Let's hope it's not endogenous. Exports, obviously, interest payments. I think if I wouldn't put all of investment in there. I think a lot of investment is endogenous. I might put depreciation, because depreciation is replacement, and that's sort of something that would go in. And I wouldn't put non-residential investment in there. I think it's very endogenous. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the end of our session. Thank you, professors.